not just this event, but so many of the amazing events that we've done in conjunction with the bicentennial celebration. It's incredibly special to be included in that, and to have this book included in that, especially because this is a book that is, I think, at least my attempt at getting at the heart of what the state is about, and trying to kind of uncover some of the forces that pull us and push us, but not only towards the future, but also towards the past as well. So for me, it's just obviously it's incredibly humbling to be here and to have been included on a list of the Next Indiana Bookshelf with other just fantastic books and authors, many of whom I've looked up to and admired for quite some time. So really remarkable thing to be able to stand here and talk to you about what it is to be a Hoosier. And that's what I'd like to direct most of my remarks tonight towards this idea of identity and what does it mean to be from Indiana? What is this idea of Hoosier? What's all wrapped up in that? And then I'll speak for a few minutes, and then we can discuss the book if you like. I don't want to presume that everybody's necessarily read it, but we'll be happy to take questions. We can talk about really any of a great number of topics. But just by way of introduction, I had seen recently a relatively hilarious map of Indiana that had broken everything down into regions and put a label on who lived there. So up in the north, it put like that kind of north corner. It was like houses and gun stores for people in Chicago, and then it said Dune people, those who play, up by Fort Wayne and South Bend, it's like those who play football and make RVs, which is really funny if you've spent any time there, which I did. I went to college up near there, and that's really pretty much all they do is play football and make RVs. In huge swaths of the middle part of the state, it was Hoosiers and more Hoosiers. Over by West Lafayette, it was like sort of Hoosiers. Down in the corner by Evansville, they said like brain eaters. They had fake Cincinnati over the corner. Here in Indianapolis, I think they put race car drivers, was just like what we were. But I thought the map, it wasn't just funny, but it also got at something that I had sort of felt for a long time, which is we have this idea kind of floating around the state, and we have for the last 20 or 30 years, that Hoosier means something very specific when it comes to Indiana. And there's the old joke is, Gary's Chicago, and really South Bend is Chicago too. But we almost start to siphon off and section off the state and say, well, that's not really Indiana, that's really this, or that's really that. And I think a lot of that stems from this moment of crystallization for our state, for our culture, which for me just so happened to come when I was 10 years old, and a very influential movie came out, and it's one that they showed here last week, and that was the movie Hoosiers. So it's really easy to see why a movie called Hoosiers that happened to also be wildly successful, so successful that they used to sell the VHS tapes at McDonald's. Everybody had the same VHS tape in the blue box that everybody bought at McDonald's, and you just watched it over and over again. And this was the day of VCRs. There weren't that many movies to begin with, and so everybody had their copy of Hoosiers, and I don't know, I must have watched it 100 times. We literally wore out a VHS tape of this movie. And like most great art, Hoosiers both reflected something about Indiana, but it also came to define something about the way that we saw ourselves as a state. And at the same time that this movie came out, it was very, very defining and tapped into something that people felt very deeply about. That's the thing that's Indiana. This small town, this underdog team. There was something about that experience that people thought, okay, this is what, when I say Hoosier, this is what I mean. But at the same time, the Indiana Hoosiers were just about to win the national championship, and they had a very specific kind of team and a very specific kind of star player as well. And those things kind of wove themselves together to create this image of this is what it means. Some of the things that Hoosiers taught us, and please understand, I have no criticism of the movie Hoosiers. It is like as much a part of the fabric of who I am as anything. So don't hear any of these things as like me pointing a finger at that movie and being like, they should have done this or that. That is a perfect piece of art, and there's no, I have nothing but love and overflowing in my heart for it, but it did do something. It did cause a specific reaction in the state. I remember the night the movie came out, I was probably about the age of my son, and my dad took us to see the movie on opening night, and literally people were reacting to the movie like the way they would at a basketball game. Over at the Glendale Theater, people were standing up and cheering. Jimmy Chitwood hits the shot, and lady behind was like, "You go, Jimmy!" People were yelling. It was crazy. It was like a basketball type environment. So like it just like it wasn't like a slow like later on people were like, I wonder if that has something to say about my experience as a Hoosier. No, people were like, no, this is it. Like from the moment it came out, it was this gripping experience, and it taught us certain things. And some of these things were prejudices that it already kind of codified or solidified, and other things were things that when it brought it up to the surface, people were just like, yes, now that's what I believe now. So among the things that we learned from that movie is basketball is king. I mean, really, it dramatized and glorified basketball itself, and it told us what basketball meant to us. And a lot of people already felt that, but then to see it up there on the big screen and see Gene Hackman, who's a huge star, to see all that happen, Dennis Hopper gets nominated for an Academy Award, to see that kind of validation, national validation, that Indianapolis has always had a chip on its shoulder. I don't know how many of you are old enough to remember. It still does. The Pacers and the Knicks in the 90s, and the Hicks versus the Knicks. There's this whole idea that like, we're just not quite good enough for everybody else, and it makes us kind of raw. So this whole idea that Hollywood, the whole nation was watching this movie, embracing this movie, was winning awards, it just contributed to this catalyzation of our own self-image. So it taught us that basketball is king, that basketball is beautiful, that it's who we are, that basketball is about defense, it's about fundamentals in defense. I literally, when I coach my son's team, I am not a good coach. Because most of what I've learned about basketball is really, I'm just like, I like this guy, I like this guy, I like hot potato, like literally, I just recreate the drills from Hoosiers, because that's all I really know. In theory, because I'm from Indiana, I should know all of these other things, but I really only know what that movie told me to know. It also taught us that basketball means Bobby Knight. The Gene Hackman character, the actual coach of the actual team, we'll talk a little bit about the history of that movie because this all plays into my book some. The actual coach of the actual Milan Miracle State Championship team was a 28-year-old guy who was like really super kind and very beloved, and everybody thought he was great. So to create more drama, Angelo Pizzo, who wrote the screenplay, thought, wonder what would happen to Bobby Knight if he punched somebody, which obviously was not a very big stretch. So he turned Bobby Knight into like Gene Hackman, an old washed up Gene Hackman. So again, this is codifying, this is what great coaching looks like. It looks like this old crusty, semi-abusive guy. It taught us that basketball was about jump shooting. At the same time, I brought this shirt here. This was a relic of my childhood, the '87 Indiana National Championship team. It's autographed by the great Steve Alford, who was a young man with perfect hair. Like literally, I just constantly, he would like go up and do a layup and his hair was never out. He was this kid from Newcastle, and he just shot. He was such a pure and perfect shooter. And so it taught us that basketball is about white guys shooting jump shots. That's where real basketball players, shooting guard, that's the position of glory in Indiana. Like you learn to shoot a certain way. Everybody goes out in their farm, because we all have farms, and we all go out in our farms and we shoot a million jump shots until you just are so good at shooting the basketball that you become this transcendent player. It taught us that basketball is about small town, and that the element of being a Hoosier is a small town kind of thing. And this is an idea that I've written about before. Indianapolis is different than a lot of major cities, and we are a major city, believe it or not. We are definitely a significant city in this country, but in most places, the city imposes its identity outward, and forces its identity out on the surrounding communities. Indianapolis has always very much drawn its sense of who it is from the rural regions around it, and it's always been a big city that feels like a small town. That's one of the things that people will always say about it. In a almost counterintuitive way, Indianapolis looked at even the movie Hoosiers, even in Indianapolis, people looked at it and were like, yeah, that's us. We're from Broad Ripple. You know, like, and I'm still looking at like Tiny Hickory High thinking, yeah, that's us, that's who we are, that's who I am. It wasn't, of course, not at all, but very much so. It taught us that basketball and being a Hoosier is about this small town kind of existence. And it taught us one more thing, and again, this is not a slight or slur on the movie, and it's not any disrespect to the people who made it, but it also taught us that basketball is white. Being a Hoosier is white. It was full of white guys. Everybody in that movie is white until the very end of the championship game. We'll talk about some of that too. But it really crystallized and solidified that who we are as a people are small town white folk. And when I was a white kid, I didn't think anything of it at the time. It didn't strike me as unusual. I just took it for granted because, again, I'm watching the Indiana University Hoosiers win with a small town white kid as the biggest star in the state. Of course, the irony of ironies is it was Keith Smart, who was a black JUCO transfer player, who actually won that game, took over the second half, and hit the game-winning Jimmy Chitwood style shot. So we'll get away from that kind of symbolism. At the time, I was just happy he hit the shot. I didn't think about it till years later. And of course, part of the reason why we have all these images, part of the reason why it came through so strongly is because Hoosiers wasn't trying to impose a worldview on us. You know what I mean? Like there was no maliciousness. Hoosiers was trying to reflect a certain reality in a certain place and time, and especially it was hearkening us back to the what I call the Hoosieriest Hoosiers in Hoosierville, which were the 1954 Milan State Championship team, the 1954 Milan Indians. They had an enrollment of 161 students. And one of the things that's crazy about the whole mythology of Milan is, first of all, they weren't just like a one-time flash in the pan. They didn't just like win a state title and all the other years they were crap. Now this was actually like a really good basketball team for several years. They had actually lost in the Final Four the year before. So this is like a really talented, consistently good team. And the other thing about Milan is they were really weird for the time. It's not like, oh yeah, prior to 1955, it was all small schools. No, it was always big schools. Big schools have always dominated the state tournament. There were always Goliaths. They always won. Nobody like Milan had ever won the tournament before. You know, Dennis Hopper jumping up and down the bed. No school this small has ever won a state title. It's because it had never happened, and it's never happened since. But at that moment that we watch this movie, and we see this iconic team rise up, and we're like, yeah, that. It's also kind of selling us a lie about ourselves. Like this is something that can happen. This is something that happened all the time. It's something that happened one time. That's why it made it so special. Of course, one of the things that we don't really realize about that Milan team, because the movie Hoosiers made every game dramatic, like down to the end. They're hitting crazy underhanded free throws and all kinds of neat stuff is happening, so they barely win every game. That team, that Milan team, actually beat a team called Crispus Attucks in the semi-state. We're going to talk about Crispus Attucks here in a minute because it plays into really who we are as Hoosiers. That Crispus Attucks team is probably the greatest high school team of all time. And Milan beat them in the semifinals with an all-time Hall of Famer, Oscar Robertson, who was a sophomore at the time. And that Milan team, it had Bobby Plump, who's the kid who hits the game-winning shot in real life, and they changed him into Jimmy Chitwood for the movie. This kid Bobby Plump goes on to be the all-time leading scorer at Butler University. This is not like a flash in the pan, like, oh, this one time they were really good. This was a really great basketball team. But through our myths, we remember them, but we don't remember them as they really were. Our myths start to impose a reality on us about what that team was about what they were, and about who we are, that alters and distorts what's really going on. So the funny thing about Milan is, if they're the Hoosieriest team in history, I just mentioned the greatest team in history, which is Crispus Attucks. And if you don't know the history of Crispus Attucks High School, it is a legacy of glory and shame for our city. Crispus Attucks, there's a wonderful, wonderful documentary just put out a couple months ago. I don't know how many of you saw it. It was beautiful, and I think you can still see it. They're airing it on PBS, WFYI, fairly regularly. I strongly encourage everybody to watch it. Crispus Attucks High School was founded out of the legacy of extreme segregation. It was a high school almost unlike anything that had been ever seen. Part of our legacy as Hoosiers that we don't often talk about was that the KKK had a massive foothold here. 1 in 3 Hoosiers was a member of the KKK during the 1920s. That is a horrible, like, rock in your throat kind of thing to say. And out of that kind of hatred and out of that that deep-rooted sense of bigotry arises this amazing institution of learning called Crispus Attucks. Crispus Attucks, obviously, as being a racially segregated school, had an all African-American team. They weren't even allowed to play in the state tournament until like the 1940s. They were forbidden from even participating alongside of white schools. But this Crispus Attucks team, not only do they have literally like one of the 10 greatest basketball players of all time, Oscar Robertson, they win the 1955 state championship. So right after the year after Milan beats them, they win the state championship. And Crispus Attucks, this is the first all African-American team to win a state title in the country. Like, this is a historically significant event that this amazing team that has like guys that are in the Harlem Globetrotter Hall of Fame, Mr. Basketball's on it. They become the first all-black team to win a state title anywhere in the country, and they follow that up in 1956 by being the first undefeated team in state history. You talk about a team to remember. This is a team to remember. But we don't have a movie about Crispus Attucks. We have a movie about Milan. We have a movie about Hickory. And again, it's not saying they shouldn't have made that movie. It's a great movie. But there is more to the story about, in the movie about Milan, we slap on that the word Hoosiers. In the movie about Attucks, we don't make at all. The fact is that Crispus Attucks ended up becoming the future, not just of basketball, but really of the state of Indiana. They played a very fast-paced game. You know, they were an all-black team, and they led us to an integrated future because teams in the Indianapolis area, the surrounding areas, got really tired of losing to Crispus Attucks year after year after year. And so sure enough, like, you think of something as trivial as basketball, and I know sometimes I have a friend that refers to things as sports ball, like almost in a derogatory sense, like basketball isn't culture, or sports in general just aren't as culturally important. And I get that sports probably play too large a role in our society. But in this case, the fact that this team was so good at something as trivial as basketball meant that schools all over the area began to integrate. And suddenly people were like, no, I need African American students in my school because we are tired of getting the doors blown off us by Crispus Attucks all the time. The funny thing about Attucks, we talked about how Milan, nothing like Milan had ever happened before, nothing like Milan had ever happened since. Crispus Attucks changed everything. In the first 43 years of the state tournament, 0 teams from Indianapolis won a state title. 0. No team from Indianapolis ever won a state title until Attucks. And the next 42 years, from 1955 to 1997, Indianapolis won 8 titles. 3 of those were won by Attucks. Then something happened, which is class basketball, which we'll talk about in a second. From over the last 18 years, Indianapolis has won 9 titles. So Attucks really foretold the future in many ways. That this is where things are headed. Things are going to an integrated environment. The pace is going to start picking up. And the city, Indianapolis, is going to start to flex its muscles in terms of its overall influence on the state, something that had never, ever happened before. The state came here to crown their champion, but Indianapolis would actually start to increase that influence outward. So my book takes place in 1997, the last year of this kind of mythical, magical tournament that was, a one-size-fits-all. Every school in the state was automatically entered. And the big guys played the little guys. After 1940, the black schools played the white schools. Before that, they didn't. And it was this environment, of course, that created this movie Hoosiers, and that we then idolized and kind of crystallized. So what I wanted to examine in my book was the underpinnings of, like, why did that go away? Why did something that meant so much to people dissipate? In the mid-90s, before they made this change, they would fill the old Hoosier Dome, the old RCA Dome, for the state finals. Literally fill like a 60,000 person stadium to watch kids play high school basketball. Immediately following, the very next year, attendance dropped in half. The overall attendance for the tournament, they lost 350,000 people the first year they switched to class basketball. And it wasn't a one-time protest. It was gone. It has never recovered. Those people never came back. This is a big thing. So what I wanted to kind of explore and get at is why? What will cause this? What would make us give up this thing that was so much a part of ourselves? The arguments at the time, what people said was, a lot of small schools said, well, we're tired of losing in our sectional. The old tournament used to have this thing called the sectional. And we can talk about the state championship and the glory. The sectional was this thing that was very cultural and very local and very specific. And the sectional was the first round of the state tournament. So all the schools in your county or your neighborhood would play each other to determine who got to go on to the next round. So for me, I went to Pike High School. If you're familiar with that side of town, the schools in my sectional were Pike and Ben Davis and Brebeuf and Speedway and Ritter and Northwest High School. So you win your sectional, you win your neighborhood. You know what I mean? Like, you're winning your side of town. That was for Indianapolis. Down south, some of the southern counties would be the 4 or 5 other primary schools in your county. So winning sectionals, even having the sectional, was this gathering of everybody from your neighborhood, everybody from your county would get together, and we're going to crown who's the best, who's the top team. So winning sectionals was like almost as big a deal as winning state. And like, that came out in the movie Hoosiers too, right? They're so, I can't believe we're sectional champs. Like, we can't believe we're sectional champs. It was meaningful because it was personal and it connected people. Well, one of the things that happened when they created this multi-class system, so big schools only played big schools and small schools only played small schools, was they took those sectionals and they chopped them all up. And so now you may not be playing, Pike wouldn't play Brebeuf anymore. You know, now it would just be like Pike and North Central and Ben Davis, or, you know, however they were going to chop them up. But it would only be large schools and the small schools, so that meant would play each other. So that meant you had to travel much further. So now your sectional wasn't just like, hey, these are the 4 or 5 teams in your county. Now it's like, no. Now it's like you may be playing guys 2 or 3 counties over to find a match for your sectional. And it just doesn't mean anything anymore. And so now it's not just about basketball, like who wins, does this team win or that team wins. The whole fabric of the thing that tied towns together, that tied neighborhoods together. And you would see guys later on that you played that were on other teams and be like, you know, we beat you, or you beat us, or whatever. But it just meant something, and it created an indescribable fabric in the community, and that was lost. The other thing that happened when they got away from this tournament was a deeply favored private schools. 1/3 of the non-4A. 4A is the largest division in Indiana. So of the 3 bottom tiers, 1/3 of the champions have been private schools. Basically, no private school won the state title until they went to class basketball. Now a full 1/3 of the champions are private schools. So what happened was small schools with money and budgets and private schools could kind of coalesce power and wealth and crown state champions. It also favored non-Indianapolis schools. You know, we just said how much Indianapolis has dominated the 4A division with 9 of the 18 champions. Well, you know, there's 3 other divisions, and of those 3 other divisions, just 9 of those champions have come from Indianapolis. So 9 of 18 of the highest division, but just 9 of 54 of the smaller divisions. So again, the idea being, hey, we're going to move power away from Indianapolis. We're going to move power away from the urban schools. We're going to move power to private schools. We're going to disrupt the fabric of the community. We're going to decimate attendance. And I don't think that anybody set out to do these things. I don't think anybody thought ahead of time, oh yeah, we're going to rip things apart and it's going to be great. And I don't think that anybody was that malicious. But there was a kind of personal, kind of selfish self-interest at the time was extremely unpopular. More than 70% of the state was overwhelmingly opposed to this move. But principals at lots of small high schools individually said, what's best for my high school is that we do this. It doesn't matter what's better for the community, what's best for my high school. And I think that undergirding some of this was a kind of racial dog whistle going on, in which people were like, there's too many black kids winning the state title. There's too many urban schools. There's too many big schools. We don't ever get to win our sectional. And again, I'm not, in this case, attributing specific malice to people. I'm not saying people had in their hearts, oh, I'm going to do something nefarious to disrupt the culture of our state or to disrupt the natural way in which things are going. I just think people acted in their own personal self-interest, again. So one of the things that I kind of try to get at in my book is to kind of unpack the mythology that this beautiful, wonderful movie Hoosiers created, this idea of small town, all white Indiana. I tried to take the main character, in the movie is Jimmy Chitwood. I kind of rewrite him as an African-American kid from Gary who's living with his aunt. It is a black kid in an all-white school, kind of symbolic of almost the experience of what a lot of African Americans feel in Indianapolis, where you can feel like you're off on an island. And the idea was to kind of just try to contrast and compare what his experience would be with that of African Americans in general. Because when we say Hoosiers means white and small, we close off belonging and identity and meaning from all kinds of people who are different, from people with different backgrounds, from people with different skin colors. I would recommend that there is a better way forward than to just continually reiterate our own myths and just to believe our own mythology to the point where it just doesn't become entertainment but becomes dictum, and it actually forces people out of something that we would love to invite them into. There's a very old story that I've always loved. It's very meaningful to me. And there's an old prophet, and he's removed from his hometown when he's basically a teenager. His city comes under judgment. He's sent into exile, and he lives this long and remarkable life. And towards the end of his life, he's sitting at the bank of a river, and he thinks about his hometown, and he starts crying. He starts crying. He starts begging forgiveness for all the horrible things that the city had done to merit his own exile. Now, keep in mind, this old prophet had never done any of those things himself. He had no ownership of them. He was removed from the situation when he was way too young to have any responsibility for anything. And most of the stuff that happened, the horrible stuff, happened well before he was ever even born. And this guy is about near a great man, one of the best men to ever live, maybe. And he's crying, he's weeping, and he's just like, I'm so sorry we did this. I'm so sorry we did this. And at that moment, it's like the heavens open, and an angel comes down and reveals to him everything that's possible, everything that's going to happen, all the ways in which the world can and will change. And it comes at this moment of responsibility in which he takes ownership of things that happened before he was ever born. Things that happened that he had no say in, that he had no voice in, and he owns them. And he takes them on his shoulders. And I love that story because I think that when it comes to this state, when it comes to being a Hoosier, and it comes to us, we can look at like, I can't do anything about the fact that the governor was a Klan member in 1924. I can't change that. I can't change the fact that they built Crispus Attucks. I can't change the fact that they didn't let African American kids play in the state tournament. I can't do anything about it. I didn't do it. My grandfather moved here in like 1953. I can't do anything about it. None of this has to do with me. And it's very easy for us to say, well, it's not my fault. None of it's my fault. Why is everyone so mad at me? And it's easy for us to say, I'm not even part of any of those groups. I'm something different entirely. And instead, I think all of us have an opportunity to, like the old prophet, look at it and say, you know what? I'm a human being. I'm part of the human race. Given the same opportunities, I might have done the same things. So I'm going to own all of this. I'm going to take it, and I'm going to acknowledge things like institutional racism, and not in a way that's about white guilt or revisionist history, but it's just simply acknowledging that the greatest team in Indiana history was born out of virulent racism, and that the greatest team in Indiana history couldn't play alongside other kids their own age for too many years, and that they won, and they triumphed over everything in an atmosphere of completely virulent racism. And this leads us, I think, to a better legacy. This leads us to something richer that we can celebrate. Because now it doesn't just become an us versus them thing. It doesn't become, well, Milan, if we talk about Crispus Attucks, we cheapen Milan? Of course not. Are you kidding me? If we know about Crispus Attucks, Milan is more amazing because they beat the greatest team in Indiana history. Maybe the greatest team in national history. That's an incredible accomplishment. Bobby Plump becomes more than just a guy who hit a jump shot one time and everybody remembers him. He becomes a symbol of a man who stood up and has repeatedly called for people to recognize how great Attucks was. If you ever talk to Bobby Plump, and he owns a bar out in Broderville, you can go talk to him, and he'll tell you how great Crispus Attucks was. It doesn't cheapen him. It doesn't lessen or belittle our heroes to add new ones. It makes them greater. The past grows richer when we acknowledge all of the people that were a part of it. And it makes our future greater. And allows us to say, wow, Oscar Robertson was an incredible player. And he's just as much mine as Bobby Plump was. It gives us a way forward. And when we own things, even the things that we don't have anything to do with, the heavens open, the angel comes down, and we are able to see a better future, a brighter one, a different one. We are able to see the end of things and to understand things clearly for the first time. So that would be my encouragement to all of you. Thank you very much for listening. I know I just rambled on for about 45 minutes about high school basketball. But obviously this is something that's very important to me, and I think that it's about more than just basketball. So I'm happy to answer questions. We do have books back there if any of you don't have any of the books. We have some of my wife's books there too. She's a young adult author. So we have books. And yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions, but thank you very much for listening. I appreciate it.
So when they switched to a class system, how did that affect other sports? Blue basketball, or the other sports?
Everything,
that community as well. It was all sport.
It was all sports. It did affect all sports. Football had already been classified for some time, and football and basketball are different sports. They require massively different numbers of people to play them. Football teams are big, and small schools barely have 30 kids on their team, and if you ever see the Carmel football team, they got like 110 kids out there. It really is a complete mismatch. This isn't like basketball, which is 5 or 10 kids, 15 kids at the most. Almost any school can field a basketball team. The amount of equipment required, the infrastructure required is very, very different. So this was applied to a lot of different sports. It was great for girls' sports, especially, again, resources. Title IX is the law that forced schools to allow equal opportunity in sports in all areas, but in this case applying it to sports, to women, and to have at least as many girls teams as they did boys teams. But a lot of school districts drug their feet and were slow to invest and slow to fulfill their legal obligation to give girls an equal chance. So the class system was very helpful and constructive, especially in girls' sports. It was useful, and for a lot of other sports, it required deeper economic infrastructure. Basketball is different, In 49 other states, it's just basketball, but this is Indiana. That's what they say before every Pacers game, right? I think I got that pretty close to right. Basketball's different. It had a different legacy, different infrastructure, different everything. So I'm not against class in general, just for basketball. Yes?
Nate, you and my brother were very good friends from 92, I think, to 95. Kevin.
Oh, cool. Neil, hi. How are you? You're Neil, right?
How would you
It's
say?
been a lot of years.
It has. I found you on Facebook, man.
I just talked to your brother last week.
Really?
Yeah.
I saw your post this afternoon. I didn't have anything going on.
Well, very cool. Thanks for coming down.
No problem. So you went to Pike, I think, from '92 to '95.
Yes, sir.
How would you characterize Pike's sporting from that point to now, through all the transitionary periods it's gone through? I guess since I think I went there with your sister from 2000. Was it 2007 from 2000?
No, 98 to 2001. 97 to 2001?
Right.
I don't know.
I don't know.
It was around doing it.
We're very old. We're very
I
old.
know. But Pike won the first year.
Yeah, so that's the thing, right?
after,
Like,
yeah.
if you want to talk about a beneficiary of this system, when I went to Pike, I think we had won like a semi-state in '78 or something. It's been a long time since Pike had significantly won anything. And of course, while I was there, Ben Davis was in the business of winning state titles. Also, Brebeuf had Alan Henderson. And so Brebeuf was great, and they kept winning the sectional. So in my high school experience, I didn't experience anything like nothing but losing in the first round of sectionals every year. And then it's the first year of multi-class basketball, Pike wins the state title. They won several more after that. I think the future was always coming. Pike was a school district very much in flux when I was there. The racial makeup, I think at the time, was something like, it was probably about 65% white, probably about 35% African American. Now it's probably like 70-30 the other direction. All my kids go to Pike schools, which we're really glad. It's an amazing school district. But there was very much a sea change in terms of the demographics, and with those demographics, state titles started to come along with them. So I've had people accuse me of being sort of Pollyanna-ish about one-class basketball because I went to Pike, and Pike kept winning state titles, but that was well after the fact. So yeah.
Do you have the feeling that in the small schools, the rural schools, they still do that thing where everybody goes on Friday night and goes to a game? Or is that something else that's...
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. So one of the consequences of this. So again, you see that in the movie Hoosiers, right? There's this whole idea that Friday night is this community bonding experience. There's nothing else to do, so everybody goes to the basketball game. Well, there was a great article in the Indy Star last month. Indiana at one time was home to 7 of the 10 largest high school gyms in the country. And those are closing, rapidly closing. We are losing beautiful architectural jewels, educational milestone jewels. Some of these great gyms around the state are shutting down because it's no longer interest in high school basketball just got stabbed through the heart. And it was that sense, I think, from people in the communities that the powers that be aren't really interested in what we have to say. Anytime you do something that's so unpopular as an administrative body, you run the risk of permanently alienating people. And the ISHAA, which in its defense is made up of schools. So in the end, it is the schools and the principals themselves that made this decision. There's not like a nameless bureaucrat somewhere that I have their face on a dartboard. It was a lot of individual principals making this call, and people lost interest. The principals let the community down, and the community decided, well, guess what? We're not going to start going to the games anymore. When you start combining that with the economic factors that lead to the gradual erosion of small town Indiana anyway, one of the themes of the book is the idea that people in small towns are very much just not even trying to progress. They're just trying to hold the line. It's about staying the same. It's about how many years in a row can we just do the same thing without losing one more family, without one more store closing down on Main Street. How many years can we just hold the line? And this move to one-class basketball for a lot of people was like, if the school doesn't care and the community doesn't care, then I guess I don't care about the school and the community. And I think it further it contributed to an environment that was always going to be hard to maintain, which is the survival of the small town.
Did football replace that?
Yeah, so that's, football has in many ways taken over and replaced that. The problem with football, attendance at state football finals now well outpaces basketball. Peyton Manning has a lot to do with that. In my other book, which is out of print currently, but I'll be revising here pretty soon, I kind of trace that argument a little bit. The problem is, as I said, football is resource intensive. So football has replaced that in Fort Wayne and in Indianapolis and a lot of small towns, especially in southern Indiana. Football has sort of picked up a little bit of that torch and that popularity. But for the really small towns, you can't feel, it's much harder to fill a football team. It just is more economically difficult. You have to have a bigger stadium, the equipment, the safety factor. So it has filled that void to some degree, but I think imperfectly.
Kind of a multi-pronged question here, but so from prior to class system, how many people attended versus after, what do you think was the main cause of that drop? Because it probably wasn't every year there was a small Milan versus, a giant Carmel or, Muncie, or anything like that. So it probably wasn't David Goliath every single year. So how many of those?
Goliath versus Goliath.
Yeah, so it was like
year.
4A.
Yeah.
So what was the draw? Like, who were those extra 300,000 people that were showing up? Was it just the people from Jasper and these other or smaller outlying communities that then lost the groundswell because they not?
Some people have argued that it's just the nature of math, that when you knock off more big schools early in the tournament, that there's just fewer people to go to the games because now you're carrying forward a lot of really small high schools who don't have a lot of fans, so that the nature of the change in the tournament will just mathematically lead you to have fewer fans. It certainly became less popular in Indianapolis. I mean, there was a time when Damon Bailey, who was the all-time leading scorer in Indiana history and had been recruited to Indiana University in the 8th grade, was pledged to go to IU at a time when that meant something really important. When Damon Bailey played the state tournament, it was like everybody in town, like this whole city turned out for that. And then, the next year, Glenn Robinson and Alan Henderson, one going to Purdue, one going to IU, two biggest stars in the state, probably the consensus two best players in America were playing each other. Again, you can argue that, hey, these are kind of like one-time special things, but again, the whole city turned out for that. The next year, even though you had in the first year of multi-class basketball, you had Indianapolis Pike and Indianapolis Cathedral, so two Indianapolis schools, half the people showed up. So where those people went, it's really hard to say, other than I just think in general, people just didn't care as much. Like, I think people felt betrayed. It's hard to know exactly and to trace them all, but I really think that the sense of betrayal is that people weren't interested. People were not interested in watching two small 1A schools play and to have everybody get their participation trophy. Those kids are state champions, that's fine, but I can't hide my biases. People didn't care. It wasn't important to people, so they just stayed home.
Do you think it took away the legitimacy of the state championship, both for the 4A schools
I think
and
it
the
did.
smaller schools? So they think the 4A schools would have won anyway. It kind of meant less.
Mm-hmm. I do. I really do. Because it was such, I don't know, how many of you ever went to a state championship game in the old dome when it was like full of people? It was really cool, right? Like, it felt like something significant. So I don't know if it's like actually, hey, there's these other classes, so like it's a worse, so it just like means less, or it was nobody cared anymore. So within a couple of years, they're now playing at Bankers Life Fieldhouse. They're playing in a much smaller venue that's like half full. Like, it just doesn't feel like a big deal. When you're playing in that big dome and there's like 50,000 people there, you win the state title, it feels like a massive accomplishment. When you're playing in a half-empty Bankers Life Fieldhouse, it just doesn't, even for the big schools that would have won anyway, it just doesn't feel like anybody cares. So I do think it at least cheapened the experience. Yeah?
Earlier you said that you experienced in high school always just had Pike just every year lost the sectionals, that was it. Did it come to a surprise to you when they started winning before.
Yeah, it was totally unbelievable. Like it felt like a foreign experience. Pike had a longtime coach named Ed Siegel, who was my economics teacher, and great guy and kind of venerable. And they named the court after him, and he'd been there for a really long time. And he retired my senior year, so I graduated in '95, and by like '98, Pike's winning state titles, and it really was weird. Like it was surreal. But I was like, oh man, I'm going to this game, and Pike is playing. And the guy that had been my baseball coach was one of the assistant coaches. And I'm looking down there on the floor, and there's my coach that I know that was my baseball coach, and he's there coaching for the high school. So yeah, it was a really weird experience. And then they weren't just good; they were like, ranked nationally. I think that team was. I think they lost one game all year. They were ranked 6th. I think their final ranking was like 5th or 6th nationally. So it was like an incredibly great team, and it was super weird that it was for Pike. Yep.
What was your so in your book? I think I see 3 big themes. So there's just a story about class basketball. There's obviously the racial undertones of it. You said telling a Christmas story type of story, and then just the fight against mediocrity and apathy, and just waking up those small towns maybe. When you went into it, what did you think? Like, I'm going to write this book because all 3, or
because what?
Because all 3. Something else I missed, or
so my wife and I were living in Argentina at the time, and we were driving through the province of Buenos Aires, which is like this giant open plain. Like it's where they have all the cattle and the cows and stuff. So we drive through this small town, and it's called La Invincible, which means the Invincible. It's this little like dirt town, and we were driving through it, and I'm like, wow, this really. First of all, I was like, what kind of people live in a town called La Invincible? Who's gonna be like, yeah, we're invincible? There's like 7 houses. Who are these people? What do they like? And then I started laughing to myself. I was like, what if they had a soccer team and they were terrible? And like that struck me as really funny. They're like trying out we're Invincible jerseys, and they're like really bad. I just thought that the idea just kind of amused me. So at the time, then it also was remarkably similar to like Northern Indiana, where we had gone to college and where we'd lived for a few years. And I started thinking about what kind of people would live in a town called Invincible, Indiana. And those 3 things sort of just came together. The class basketball thing was just something that was always raw in my mind. I hadn't gotten over it, still not over it. It's been like 18 years. I don't get over things very much. So I was like still dealing with that, but then just this whole idea of like faith and this whole idea of the battle against mediocrity. My wife had taught high school in Tippy Valley, which is very much like the school described in Invincible. Invincible is probably located around the town of Silver Lake. If there's a town, if you're ever driving north on 15, I'm sorry, but there's a town called Silver Lake there, and that's more or less where Invincible is located in my mind. I have people, you can triangulate it based on the other schools that they play. You can kind of figure out where it is, but that's where it really is. And our experiences there had like kind of stuck with us. There's a little bit of a fish out of water story too, because we're living in Argentina, which is again like a very fish out of water experience. So wanted to even process some of my own experiences of being an outsider and trying to adapt to a community, and then substituting in this community that we had left, the community we were currently in. So all of those things kind of came together, led to why we were looking.
You want to be the soccer coach of La Invincible?
Yeah, that would have gone poorly, I think. Would have gone very poorly.
Hands up.
Hot potato. That's really funny if you've seen the movie. Very cool. Any other questions? I really appreciate your guys' time. I want to be respectful of it, and I appreciate you bearing with me so patiently. Well, thank you all very much, and be sure to patronize all the other awesome events.